DC Comics Absolute Universe, and to a lesser degree, Marvel Comics Ultimate Universe are all the rave right now. It's all anyone can talk about. If you go on YouTube and you say even slightly not glowing words about them, you will be bombarded with negative comments. Be like, what are you talking about? Ultimate Spider-Man is the greatest comic book of the last 25 years. This is my Superman, man. And all these stupid fucking comments. And certainly, there's some very strong sales initially out the gate from Ultimate Universe, and right now out the gate for the Absolute Universe. And a lot of people are calling on or asking when the Ultimate Universe and Absolute Universe will overtake DC Prime in the Marvel 616. In fact, there's an article from the Popverse. It's the year of the alternate timelines for both of America's largest comic book publishers. The Ultimate Marvel and Absolute DC lines have taken the world's most popular superheroes and reimagined them towards massive sales success. So much so, you'd be forgiven for thinking the publishers would be tempted to ditch their regular continuities to focus on the hot new thing, but that's never going to happen, at least not according to a person who's been in the industry for longer than either concept has ever even existed. So there you go. Lots of people are asking this question. They even went to Tom Ford himself, the man with the hat Substack newsletter, where he answers questions. And I'll give him this. As far as comic book people out there that are in key roles of influence and leadership, he is far more open than basically anybody. You send him a question, he'll answer the question to the best of his ability. But it is a silly question. Of course, they're not going to end up replacing the DC Prime universe, the Marvel 616, with these Johnny-come-lately weird, edgy takes on classic heroes. These things happen all the time. I hate to break it to you. The Ultimate Universe isn't a new concept. In fact, we already had an Ultimate Universe. The Absolute Universe isn't a new concept. We have the New 52. We had Earth 1. We had all-star lineups and all that kind of stuff. We've had Elseworlds for a very, very long time, which are basically different versions of these, although these do have a shared continuity. But the question did go out to Mr. Tom Brevoort, and I don't always agree with the man. In fact, a lot of times I don't. But every once in a while, he has a little shred of common sense and explains why this shit just ain't happening. You know, whenever one of these alternate universe sparks some momentary heat, there are always some fans like yourself that ask this question, Vic. But the obvious answer is no, of course not. For one thing, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the way the mainstream Marvel or DC books are selling. For another, there's no evidence that the momentary interest in Ultimate or Absolute is going to be able to maintain that interest over the long haul. Just look at DC's New 52 from a decade ago. For about a year, it did gangbusters, as it was a big new thing, and then immediately thereafter, the entire line began to crater, so much so that they pivoted to doing Rebirth to bring back a bunch of the stuff that they'd gotten rid of for New 52. And all the while, the Marvel Universe just kept on selling and kept on being relevant. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. All right, so maybe I don't agree with everything he said there. I do not believe that the mainstream books are just selling like gangbusters. They're probably selling just enough not to lose the money, which I guess breaking even or maybe a slight bit of profit on those books is just enough because they are seen as movie properties, animation properties, video game properties, television show properties at this point. And really the comics are just the cherry on top if you talk to Disney or Warner Brothers. They're not exactly caring if these comic books end up selling a whole lot of copies and actually turn a big profit. That's one of the reasons that Marvel and DC can be so mediocre these days. But he does make a great point that these things happen all the time. And a lot of times because it's a new version of classic heroes that are taking a new direction, doing things that you could never do with Superman or Batman or Spider-Man or Iron Man or any of these characters, that they do catch fire because people are interested in new things. And there are speculators out there and there is spec value on different versions or iterations of heroes, because a lot of times they'll end up being in movies, or maybe they'll be featured on a cartoon series that ends up being beloved, or a video game or a television show or something like that. People will become attached to those versions of the heroes, and then they'll want, a copy of the very first appearance, the first time these things ever came out, or maybe they'll want a complete run of what inspired this version of the character that ended up being my favorite version of Batman or Spider-Man or whatever. And these are absolutely normies that get really attached that way. Obviously, us comic geeks can do it as well, but a lot of times it's normies that get bamboozled on the spec stuff in the end. But that's why these things catch like wildfire, because they could end up being very valuable. There is interest in new iterations of the characters, but they almost always, and I do mean always, not almost, just always, flame out. They have a shelf life. They come out, they sell like gangbusters. People start questioning, well, what about the original Spider-Man? Should we even do stories with him? Does anybody even think Superman's relevant anymore? As you're doing this weird take like Injustice on Superman. And then 3 years later, the sales start to decrease because there's only so many weird things that you can do with Superman before Superman fans are like, you know what? I don't think I like this version of Superman. I think I'll go back to the real Superman. And then all the normies that came in on spec value or just interest, maybe they read an article on it and then they realized, you know what? I don't think I like reading comic books. What am I even doing here reading Injustice? I'll just play the video game. Or something like The Dark Knight Returns. We've had lots and lots of sequels. What happens every time there's a new sequel for The Dark Knight Returns? Despite, 20 or 30 years later, you would think the comic buying audience would grow. No, the sales always decrease because there's less interest over time because there are only so many things that you can do to these characters. And the same thing will happen with the Ultimate Universe. Now, I do wholeheartedly believe, the Ultimate Universe that Marvel's created has a much longer shelf life than what we've seen thus far, and it is very, very early on to what DC is doing with their Absolute Universe. Because for the most part, in a lot of cases, Marvel are tweaking and changing slightly. For the most part, slightly tweaking the main solo heroes that they're using in their Ultimate Universe. The Spider-Man that we're getting now became Spider-Man later, but he's married, he's got kids, but he's basically Peter Parker. If you go to Ultimate Black Panther, I cannot tell you what differentiates Ultimate Black Panther from the actual Black Panther. Now, they are making a lot bigger changes in the Ultimates because Dennis Camp is a moron, and that's why he should fit into the Absolute Universe like a hand in a glove. But because those interpretations of the characters are so much more closely aligned to the actual characters, they will have a longer shelf life because it will take a lot longer before they become irrelevant or people are turned off and like, you know what, why am I even reading this anymore? Because it does genuinely feel like Peter Parker. Whereas in the Absolute Universe, they are making wholesale massive changes to the characters. Everything in Absolute Batman is enormous. They should just call it Gigantic Batman. Batman's gigantic. His axe is gigantic. His logo's gigantic. His Batmobile's gigantic. Everything is gigantic in Absolute Batman. And he's not the same character. There's not much similar between actual Bruce Wayne and the Absolute Bruce Wayne. Almost two different characters completely. If you look at Absolute Wonder Woman, no, that's not Diana Prince. It's a completely whole cloth different version of that character. And because they are diverging off so far, so fast, I do believe that will lead to wide-scale rejection much sooner than the Ultimate Universe that Marvel are doing under the watchful eye of Jonathan Hickman. Especially Absolute Superman, which is an absolute abomination. I will be talking about that, I believe, on Monday in a full video here on the channel on how much I did not like that comic book. And so Tom Brevoort is completely right. These things have a shelf life. They never last in the end. People are always looking at the hot new thing, but in the end, they always go back to old reliable. Real Batman, real Superman, real Spider-Man, real Iron Man, and all that kind of stuff. He also talked about why they haven't done a DC Marvel collaboration in quite some time. And I thought this was pretty illuminating. Marvel isn't all that interested in doing a lot of crossovers. DC, for the last several years, has seemed much more open to doing them, but whenever Marvel does participate in one, there tends to be some reason for this internally, some objective that making a crossover helps us to achieve, but each circumstance is different, so I can't tell you why we do each and every one, nor which instances came from Marvel reaching out to others, and which ones were the result of others reaching out to us. The real answer is all the above. So obviously they are reprinting the DC Marvel amalgam universe and the crossovers and all that stuff that they did back in the day. And to much fanfare, people were very, very happy with it, despite not being all that great across the line. Yes, there are some cool stories in there, but it's not like all of them were great. Most of them were average or below average. People really enjoy the Marvel DC crossover stuff, and they're always calling for it. But we're not going to get it anytime soon. We won't get it until Marvel absolutely feels desperate that they need something to increase sales. Obviously, by his previous statement, he does not feel desperate for sales. If Tom Brevoort and Marvel Comics felt desperate for sales, they would have hired somebody good to write X-Men comic books. They hired literally a gaggle of fucking morons to write the books because they do not care if the books sell. At some point, they will get into a position where they've killed sales off and interest in Marvel to a degree enough that they will reach out to DC and be like, hey, let's do a collab. And when it serves their very best interest, then it will happen. I don't think DC has any issues with this. It actually seems like DC really likes to do things like this. It's Marvel that really ends up being the problem, but they are the big dog in the industry. Where Marvel goes, the entire comic book industry goes. And right now, they're feeling very content with their place in the market, despite the fact that I think every comic book fan out there would admit Marvel Comics absolutely suck right now. There's almost no quality across the board, and DC is certainly on an uptick. Have they reached DC Rebirth levels yet? No, not even close. But it's a lot better than it was, and it's certainly a lot better than Marvel. But once their sales bottom out, they'll reach out, they'll do some crossovers, it'll generate some interest, people will be excited again, and then they'll rest on their laurels and kill off the industries more. It's kind of what they do. It's very cyclical. Mr. Mark Miller talks about that all the time, the cyclical nature of the comic book industry, and Marvel certainly is in a hibernation stage right now. They do not care about quality. They do not care about their creative teams. They do not care about their fans because they are sleeping on everything. Completely asleep at the wheel these days. And I do want to say thank you very much for joining me today. If you enjoy what I'm doing, providing a perspective on the comic book industry, trying to provide some levity and honest assessment of everything going on, the good, bad, and everything in between, and you would like to support me in Thinking Critical's mission here on YouTube, I do want to invite you to come visit me on Thinking Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description. Lots of different podcasts featuring your favorite guests on Thinking Critical YouTube. Longer format, over 40 hours of new stuff every single month for you to enjoy, depending on the tier that you support on. Hope to see you there very, very soon.